I never set out to scare people. But the silence I carry is louder than any scream. From the earliest moments I can remember, I sensed the weight of my own thoughts pressing against a world that demanded lightness. It was never about violence or anger. It was the quiet depth within me, a depth that made others uncomfortable, even fearful. I was not loud, not threatening in the usual ways. My danger was subtle, hidden in my silence, in the way my eyes seemed to see past facades and expose truths people wished to bury. They didn't know what to do with that. My silence unsettled them more than any harsh word could. The way I refused to fill empty spaces with meaningless chatter. The questions I asked not to provoke. But because I couldn't help myself, felt like cracks in the carefully constructed walls they all hid behind. I remember a night that forever burned itself into my memory. The village square was alive with firelight, flickering and dancing on worn faces that once greeted me warmly. But that night, those same faces twisted into something colder, more distant, like statues carved from ice. The firelight caught the subtle shift in their eyes. Suspicion, fear, avoidance. I walked through that crowd and felt the weight of their whispers crawling behind me, like shadows that stretched long into the night. "Who is he really?" they asked. "What does he want?" The questions hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. I was no enemy, but to them, I might as well have been, because I was a mirror reflecting their own illusions back at them, illusions they clung to, the masks of normalcy, of comfort, of shallow contentment. That night, standing alone in the cold silence beyond the firelight, I felt the truth settle over me like a shroud. My danger wasn't in what I said or did. It was in what I refused to be: predictable, comfortable, compliant, freedom. That word echoed through my mind like a curse and a blessing intertwined. Freedom from the endless performance of daily life. Freedom from the hunger for approval that gnawed at so many souls around me. Freedom from the chains of expectation that bound them all like invisible shackles. But that freedom was a threat. A threat to a society built on control. Control through conformity. Control through silence. Control through fear. And so, they feared me. Not because I was violent or cruel or unkind, but because I was unconditioned, because I carried within me a clarity they could neither understand nor tolerate. In that moment, I realized my path was destined to be a lonely one. The clarity I sought was not a gift to be shared lightly. It was a burden, a cross to bear. For in a world addicted to illusions, the man who sees too clearly becomes an exile. This realization planted a seed of dread deep within me, dread not of death or pain, but of isolation. Because to walk in truth was to walk alone. And yet, I could not turn back. I was caught in the web of a tragic destiny, drawn to knowledge, driven by a restless hunger to understand what lay beneath the surface, even as the world recoiled from what I found. Days after that night, I would find myself wandering the village streets in silence, feeling the eyes of others like invisible chains around my throat. People passed me with quick, averted glances, as if acknowledging my existence might awaken some uncomfortable truth best left buried. There was a woman, Marin, who once smiled at me openly, but even she retreated when I began to speak of things she couldn't bear to hear, of the emptiness behind their smiles. The lies they told themselves just to survive another day. Her eyes, once warm, became glassy and distant, fearful, as if my words had pierced her very soul. I understood then that my clarity was not welcomed even by those I cared for. It alienated me from the very human connections I craved. The deeper I sank into thought, the more the world around me slipped away. Each step I took toward truth felt like a step away from companionship. It was a slow unraveling, quiet exile. And yet, there was a strange comfort in this solitude, a purity of purpose. In the stillness of my own mind, I confronted questions that no one else dared face. Who am I beneath the roles I play? What meaning lies beyond the hollow rituals of daily life? Can one truly be free if freedom means being cast out? These questions haunted me, gnawed at me like invisible flames. I felt the growing chasm between who I was and who the world wanted me to be. It stretched wider with each passing day. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would sit by the window of my small room and watch the stars scatter cold light across the sky. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. But in that silence, I found a terrible clarity. I saw myself not as a man who could bend to the whims of others, but as a man condemned to stand apart. A man whose soul was too restless, too piercing, to ever find peace in the shallow waters of conformity. I was like a solitary wolf, howling into the void, not out of anger, but out of longing. Longing for a world that could accept the dangerous light I carried. But such a world did not exist, and perhaps never would. This was the bitter irony of my fate. To be gifted with insight was to be burdened with exile. To be awake was to be condemned to solitude. And to carry the truth in a world built on illusion was to carry a silent threat and unseen danger that made others flinch. So I wear my silence like armor. Not because I wish to hurt, but because I must protect what little remains of myself in a world eager to dilute and control. I never set out to scare people, but the silence I carry, this quiet, unyielding refusal to conform, is louder than any scream. And in that silence, I walk my destined path, alone. The deeper I loved, the more alone I became. There's something quietly disturbing about the human face, not in its form, but in its theater. Over time, I developed an eye for the smallest fractures, those subtle twitches in the corner of the mouth, the hesitations between words, the forced upward curl of a smile hiding a soul too tired to speak its truth. People say love is blind. I've found the opposite to be true. Love, if it is real, sees too much. It was never that I lacked affection. Quite the contrary, my love was sharp. It didn't stroke egos. It dismantled illusions. And that's what made it unbearable to most, especially to women raised in a world that confuses adoration with validation.
I remember Alina.
She was a painter, known in our province for capturing beauty with terrifying precision. Her portraits were lifelike, no, more than lifelike. They revealed things people didn't know they were showing. That's what drew me to her. I thought perhaps someone who could see into others would recognize what I carried within myself. We spent hours together, speaking without flattery. No false charm, no empty affirmations, just presence. Just silence that wasn't hollow but sacred. But the longer I stayed, the more restless she became. One day I watched her try to paint me. She stared, brush poised, but her hand trembled. After a while, she dropped the brush and whispered, "I can't capture you, why?" I asked. She looked down. "Because you see too clearly. I feel naked when you look at me. Like you already know what I'm hiding, even when I don't." That was the last time we spoke. I hadn't touched her, hadn't raised my voice, hadn't judged. And yet my presence was enough to make her vanish. I've seen it happen too many times. My quiet ruins the performance. You see, most people don't want to be seen. They want to be admired. There's a difference. Admiration allows for distance, for illusion, but to be truly seen. That strips away the curated self, the mask built over years of careful compliance. And when you take away the mask, what remains is either something whole or something hollow. That is the terror. To be loved by someone who sees you without distortion means you can no longer hide from yourself. I began to realize I was not just a man to others, as a mirror, a dangerous one. Not because I exposed anyone deliberately, but because my clarity made self-deception impossible in my presence. And most people depend on self-deception the way a drowning man depends on the illusion of air. I walked the streets and watched lovers cling to each other like lifeboats. Not out of truth, but out of shared delusion. "Tell me I'm enough," their eyes pleaded. "Tell me I matter even if I haven't looked within." But I couldn't lie, not even to comfort, and so they hated me for it. Love, I found, is rarely about truth. It is about roles, about trade. You play the adorer, I'll play the adored. You bring the illusion of safety, I'll bring the illusion of intimacy. But I was incapable of such theater. Every time I stepped on their stage, I ruined the script. I asked questions no one wanted to answer. Do you truly love him, or just fear being alone? Are you with her because you see her, or because she reflects what you want to be? They'd look at me like I had stabbed them because in a way, I had. But it was never with a knife. It was with reality. There was another woman, Mara. She once told me, "You make me feel like I'm failing some invisible test." I replied gently, "There is no test. Only truth." She left the next day. That's when the paradox became inescapable. The more honest my love became, the more alone I was. Because to love authentically, one must risk being rejected, not for cruelty, but for clarity. And clarity is a lonely thing. I often sat by the edge of the river at dusk, watching the water move without effort, honest in its direction. I envied it. The river never had to pretend to be a lake to be loved. It simply moved forward, indifferent to whether anyone followed. But I was not a river. I still longed to be understood. And that longing became my greatest internal conflict. How can a man desire intimacy, yet be repelled by the illusions intimacy often requires? How can he yearn to be known, yet find that to be known is to be feared? There is a kind of despair that Kierkegaard called the sickness unto death, not physical death, but the slow suffocation of the soul when it is estranged from its essence. I felt that sickness creeping into me like winter through the cracks in an old house, not loud, not sudden, just present, constant. I began to walk with it, sleep with it, think with it. And yet I did not turn away, because even in that despair, there was a strange purity, a kind of spiritual solitude, a silence so complete that I could finally hear the voice beneath all the noise. "This is the price," it said. "To see clearly is to walk alone." And so I did. It's not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but because the alternative was to play a role I could no longer believe in. In the end, I learned that the faces we wear are not for protection. They are prisons. And the moment you take yours off, others will try to make you wear theirs. Not out of malice, but out of terror. Terror of what your unmasked presence says about their hidden selves. Became the threat, not because I intended to be, but because I refused to pretend. And in that refusal, I lost much. But I found myself, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was worth everything. To see clearly is to bleed without wounds. I was warned, though never in words. There's a silence that wraps itself around the man who begins to truly see. Not the silence of serenity, but the silence of exile. It starts slowly. A missed invitation here, a cold glance there. The laughter at shared delusions no longer reaches you because you've stopped pretending they're funny. It's not that I chose isolation. It's that awareness comes with a toll. It's that the first thing it strips from you is your place in the crowd. One by one, the people in my life drifted like fog thinning in the morning sun. Old friends who once shared fireside drinks began to look at me, as if I were a shadow standing too close. They didn't say it outright, but I could feel it in their shrinking smiles. "You've changed." But I hadn't changed. I had only begun to see. And that, it turns out, is a kind of betrayal, at least to those who still need the illusion to sleep at night. Remember the last conversation I had with Matthias, my oldest companion. We sat beneath the ancient linden tree by the monastery wall. It had been our meeting place since boyhood. We spoke of old stories, old wounds. Then, without warning, he said, "Why must you always dissect everything, brother? Can't you just enjoy life like the rest of us?" There was no malice in his voice, only fear. The kind of fear that clings to simplicity like a dying man to air. I looked at him and said nothing, because the truth is no, I couldn't. Not anymore. You cannot unsee the gears once you've glimpsed the machine. That night, he left without saying goodbye. The next time I passed the village tavern, I saw him laughing with the very men who once mocked us both for being too quiet, too strange. I understood then that memory meant nothing when comfort was threatened. But it wasn't just friends. The women who once found my silence mysterious soon called it cold. They mistook my stillness for distance, my depth for detachment. I recall one lover, Solda. Eyes were kind, but filled with hunger, not for truth, but for certainty. She wanted me to belong to her illusions, not to myself. "Why don't you need me?" she asked one morning, her voice trembling. I didn't know how to explain that needing her would have required me to abandon a part of myself. Not because she was unworthy, but because I was no longer willing to play the role of the dependent man, the romantic puppet performing on command. My love was real, but it wasn't compliant. She left with tears and slammed doors, whispering a curse I've heard in different forms my entire life. You make people feel small, but I never tried to. I simply refused to shrink, and that refusal comes with a cost. The days grew quieter. The long halls of my home echoed with memories more than voices. I took walks deep into the forest, past the tree line where the world forgets its own name. There, the stillness didn't judge me. The trees didn't recoil. The wind didn't demand a simpler version of me. In that solitude, I came face to face with something few ever meet willingly: myself. And what I found was not always noble. Beneath the calm exterior, there was pain raw, ancient, unhealed. The boy who had learned too early that intelligence isolates. The man who had mistaken solitude for superiority, then realized it was simply the last refuge of the awake. There were nights the silence roared, where the absence of warmth felt like ice pressed to bone. I'd lie awake and wonder if I had made a mistake, if perhaps I should have smiled more, spoken less, pretended, just enough to be held. But then a truth would rise in me like fire. To remain unconscious is not innocence, it is surrender. I could not surrender. Because the moment I began to water down my soul to fit into someone else's comfort, I would cease to be myself. And that, to me, was the only sin that mattered. I thought often of Kierkegaard, his quiet despair. He once wrote that the greatest danger was to lose oneself, as if it were nothing. I now understood that passage not as philosophy, but as prophecy. Awareness, true awareness, is a wound that never scabs. You stop bleeding only because you become the blade. And yet, strangely within that pain, there is a sacred clarity. I began to see rejection not as punishment, but as purification. Those who left were not robbing me. They were making space. Each silence, each absence, carved out room for truth, room for alignment. And when you begin to live in alignment, something strange happens. You begin to lose things: status, invitations, lovers, approval, but you begin to gain weight. It's not physical weight, but gravity. The kind that bends rooms around you. The kind that forces people to face what they've buried. And that is terrifying. It's not just to them, but sometimes to you, because clarity is not peace, not at first. Clarity is chaos. It burns through illusions like fire through parchment. It shows you what was always there and dares you to walk forward without flinching. So I did, one foot in front of the other, not seeking applause, not seeking company, it's only seeking truth. And that path, though narrow and thorned, was mine. And I would rather walk it alone than be welcomed on a road that required the death of my awareness. I did not choose solitude to escape others. I chose it to find the part of myself they tried to erase. There comes a point when a man stops knocking on doors that only open to performance. For me, that point arrived in winter, when the wind outside matched the coldness I began to feel from those once closest to me. Not hatred, no. Hatred has heat. What I received was indifference, quiet erasure. At first, I fought it, tried to explain, to soften the sharpness of my gaze, to dull the edges of my words so they might go down easier. I tried to meet them halfway. But the more I tried, the more I vanished. You cannot bend yourself for the sake of others without eventually snapping something essential. So I stopped, not out of pride, out of survival. I retreated not into bitterness, but into clarity. I walked away from conversations that demanded I'd be less, from relationships that mistook stillness for emptiness, from tables where laughter was hollow and intimacy was just an exchange of needs dressed as affection. People called it arrogance, as they always do when a man stops performing, but they never saw the nights that followed. Nights where the silence was thick and accusing, where I would stand by the window of my small, candlelit study and watch the snow fall without sound, feeling like the world was moving on without me. Nights when memory became a torment, faces I once loved flashing behind my eyelids, not with warmth, but with weight. You see, solitude isn't quiet, it screams. It screams everything you've ever ignored about yourself. There is a moment I cannot forget. I was walking alone through the ruins of the old monastery on the hill. The sun was low, casting broken light through the shattered windows. The chapel was empty, its stone floor cracked with time, but something in it spoke to me. I stood where the altar had once been, and a question rose in me like a ghost. Will you still walk this path if no one claps for you? If no one understands? I couldn't answer. It's not then. because part of me still longed for witness, for someone to say, I see you, and you're not too much. But slowly, painfully, I realized, the desire to be seen had been my last tether to a self shaped by others. So I cut it. I embraced the loneliness, like a fever. Let it burn away everything false. And when the fire passed, I wasn't empty. I was revealed. This wasn't isolation. This was initiation. People think solitude is escape, but for me it was confrontation. Every unshed tear, every buried truth, every voice I'd silenced for the sake of belonging, they all rose like phantoms in that stillness. There were days I doubted myself, days when the ache of touchlessness made my skin feel foreign, when I'd catch my reflection and not recognize the man who stared back. He was leaner, now less adorned, more precise. A man stripped of illusions. But I never turned back. So once you walk the solitary path long enough, something strange happens. You stop craving company. Not because you don't feel, but because you begin to understand the cost of being misunderstood. And worse, the cost of pretending not to be. I recall a village festival in spring. I stood on the edge of the crowd. The air smelled of roasted meat and flowers. Music danced between bodies. Laughter was loud, intoxicating. Someone saw me and waved me over. A woman I had once loved before, my silence became unbearable to her. For a brief moment, I stepped toward her. But then I saw it. Not her smile, but the expectation behind it. She wasn't calling me back. She was calling back a version of me that no longer existed. So I turned away. Not from her. It's from the lie she needed me to be. The solitary path is not noble. It's not romantic. It is raw, unsparing. It forces you to witness the death of every identity you once wore for acceptance. And there is no applause for that. Only the slow, quiet unfolding of a self that can finally stand naked in the storm without asking the wind for mercy. And still there is longing. The paradox never leaves. You want connection, but not at the cost of your clarity. You want love, but not if it means returning to the theater of roles and scripts and conditioned needs. You ache, but you refuse to beg. This is the crucible. And like all crucibles, it does not leave you as it found you. It distills, it purifies, leaves behind only what cannot be burned. And what remained in me after the burning was presence. It's not the presence that demands to be noticed, but the kind that makes others uncomfortable simply by existing. They still call me distant. But what they feel is the distance between themselves and their own truth. I merely reflect it. And that is why the solitary man is feared. Not because he is cold, but because he is whole. Not because he cannot love, but because he will not perform. Not because he is unreachable, but because he refuses to be touched by anything that asks him to shrink. I walk alone now, not as punishment, as protection, as protest, perhaps ultimately as prophecy. Because in every era, there are those who must disappear from the crowd. To become the mirror the crowd can no longer face. I did not raise my voice. I simply stopped apologizing, and that was enough to make them scream. The true judgment didn't come with torches or mobs. It came in quieter ways, half-smiles that didn't reach the eyes, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, hands that once held mine, now resting in other laps, safe and forgetful. I had become the pariah. Not for what I did, but for what I refused to do. Perform. They called me arrogant. But they never saw how many nights I wept into my pillow asking the stars what I'd done wrong. They called me aloof. But they never saw the ache I carried in my chest like an old wound. How I longed to be understood just once, without shrinking to fit. They called me unloving. But they never saw how I remembered the exact texture of her voice when she said my name like it meant something. They never saw how I held back every time I wanted to reach out, chose silence instead, because love offered on the altar of conformity is not love at surrender. They thought their labels would shame me back into the script. But they underestimated the cost I had already paid just to stand where I stood. There was a day I still remember with excruciating clarity. A village elder, once a mentor to me in my youth, stopped me in the town square. His eyes were hard, not angry, but disappointed, which was worse. You used to be such a promising man, he said. You could have had respect, a family, a role in the council. But now look at you. wandering, speaking in riddles, alone. I looked at him, really looked into the creases that told of a life lived obediently, into the weariness behind his practiced disapproval. I said softly, "What if I was never meant to be promising? What if I was meant to be dangerous?" He turned away, but not before I saw the flicker of fear behind his scorn, because he knew. He knew there was a part of him that had wanted to walk away too, but he never did, and I had. That was my reckoning, not their rejection, my recognition, that the more whole I became, the more unbearable I would be to those who had traded authenticity for acceptance. And they knew it. So they painted me as a villain because that's easier than asking whether the villain might be the only one telling the truth. I learned then, rejection isn't personal. It's the immune response of a society allergic to sovereignty. They rejected me not because I was cruel, but because I was clear. Because I asked questions no one wanted to answer. Why are we performing for love? Why do we applaud masks and exile mirrors? Why does peace feel boring and chaos feel romantic? They did not answer. They ridiculed instead. And in their laughter I saw desperation. Because mockery is the final weapon of those who fear what they cannot control. There is a kind of silence that settles over you when the last person you love no longer looks you in the eyes. It happened one evening as dusk fell over the valley. She stood across from me, her arms crossed, not in anger, but in self-protection. "You make everything so heavy," she whispered. "Why can't you just let things be?" I wanted to scream, because nothing has ever just been, because every let it be has always meant bury it. Bury the questions, bury the grief, bury the truth. But I said nothing, because I had learned that not every silence is surrender. Sometimes it is the final form of resistance, and so she left, and I remained. And in her absence I felt the last thread of the old world snap. They called it loneliness, but I called it liberation. Yet let me be clear, it was not painless. There were days I walked the forest trails and screamed into the trees just to remind myself that I still had a voice. Nights when I wrote letters I never sent, poured ink across parchment like blood from a wound. Letters that began with, "I miss you," and ended with, "but not enough to become someone else for you." That is the cruel clarity of awakening. You see the cost of staying asleep. But you also feel, deeply, the ache of having no one to share your awakening with. That is the tragic fate of the conscious man. Not that he is hated, but that he is unreadable. And in a world addicted to simple stories, what cannot be read is feared. I began to notice something strange. People didn't just distance themselves from me, they reshaped their memories of me. They began to say things I had never said, to twist my silence into arrogance, my distance into malice, my boundaries into punishment. It was easier, I suppose, to believe I had become cold than to admit they were the ones who had grown too weak to face warmth without performance. But I didn't fight back. Not because I lacked fire, but because I no longer needed the world to agree with me in order to know I was right. That is the reckoning. Not the fury of others, but the serenity of being unshaken by it. I learned that to live in truth is to be misunderstood, that clarity will always be called cruelty by those who benefit from confusion, that a man who cannot be moved by approval will always be mistaken for cruel. So I stopped correcting them. Let them whisper, let them point, let them shrink in my presence. I will not be less to make them feel more. When I walk past them now, when their eyes flicker away, their voices lower, their laughter dies in my silence, I feel no vengeance, only gravity, only the weight of a soul that no longer negotiates its worth. They call it pride, but it's not pride. It's peace. And that, in the end, is what they fear most. Faith begins where reason breaks. I did not jump because I was certain. I jumped because I could no longer stay. The day I walked away from everything I was supposed to be. The sky was graying, not storming, not calm, just ... gray. That kind of weather that mirrors the inside of a man who's on the verge of vanishing or becoming. I remember standing at the edge of that riverbank, the same place I once sat as a boy, skipping stones, dreaming of futures they'd already written for me. Husband, worker, provider, protector, puppet. I shed those names that day, one by one, not with anger, but like removing garments soaked with someone else's sweat. Kierkegaard once wrote that the leap of faith is not a jump into certainty, but into dread, into absurdity. And so I leaped, not outwardly, but inward, into the void that stretched between who I was told to be and who I might become if I dared. I wish I could say it was liberating, but the truth, it felt like dying because something did die. The agreeable man? The man who smiled when something was fake? The man who said yes to avoid being alone? The man who swallowed his questions and called it maturity? That man collapsed beneath me the moment I said, no more, and in his place, it was only silence. If you ever stood in a silence so loud it feels like it could break bone, that's where the leap takes you. Not to heaven, not to peace, but to the raw, unbearable honesty of being unformed. For weeks I wandered through what I now call the desert of unknowing. Days blurred, meals forgotten, sleep restless. I lived off questions, starved of certainty. And every voice I'd once trusted began to dissolve in my mind. Parents, priests, lovers, teachers. Their advice, once scripture, now rang hollow.
I no longer wanted answers.
I wanted real. And real, I learned, doesn't come with handrails. I remember one night in particular. I hadn't spoken to anyone in days. My beard grew wild, my fingernails dirty. I wasn't surviving. I sat beneath an old cypress tree, its branches skeletal against a violet sky. I stared up for hours, and somewhere in the cold dark a truth formed, not in words but in ache. You are alone now, and no one is coming. That wasn't fear. It was freedom. It meant whatever came next would be mine, not inherited, not copied, not approved. Mine, that is the cost of the leap. You don't just lose your old roles. You lose your old gods, and that's terrifying. Because the world does not love a man without a role, a man without a label, a man who no longer performs. They don't know where to place him, so they exile him. He becomes the fool, the failure, the madman. But inside, he is becoming something unnameable, a man not built, but born from silence, from solitude, from truth. One morning, I awoke on the banks of that same river. A thin fog clung to the ground like memory. I looked into the water and saw not my reflection, but the absence of it. As if the man I once was had dissolved. What remained was only outline, shadow, potential. And then I saw a shape behind me in the fog. A woman I once loved, not flesh memory. She stepped closer and I heard her voice from long ago. Why can't you just be like everyone else? I didn't respond. I couldn't, because in that moment I knew that was never the real question. The real question was, why do I feel like I am only myself when I am alone? I turned away from her, from the echo of who I might have been had I chosen comfort over truth, and I walked deeper into the fog. Let them say I vanished. Let them say I lost everything. They're not wrong. But what I gained, they'll never understand. I gained my own voice, not the echo of a tribe, but the slow, sacred emergence of a soul. I gained my own silence, not the silence of shame, but the silence of presence. I gained the ability to say, no, not to reject, but to refine, to say this is not worthy of who I am becoming. That kind of clarity doesn't come cheap. It costs you everything that made you acceptable, but it gives you something priceless in return, the right to exist as yourself. The leap, as Kierkegaard warned, offers no guarantees. It might break you. It might unravel your life, your identity, your beliefs. It will almost certainly leave you misunderstood. But it will also give you your soul back. And that is a price worth paying. So if you find yourself standing at your own edge, at the brink of losing the only version of yourself you've ever known, ask not, will I survive this? Ask, what if I don't leap, and I never truly live? Staying where you are is also a death. It's just quieter. It's more polite, but no less tragic. So I stepped, and I keep stepping. Not because I know where it leads, but because I know where pretending ends. And I've already died there once. I became what they feared most, not a monster, not a threat, but a reflection.
Oh.
There is a strange pain that comes with seeing too clearly. Not because the truth itself wounds you, but because others flinch when it reflects off your face. In my solitude, I became something I had never intended. A mirror, not a prophet, not a rebel, not even a wise man. Just surface. Cold, still, honest, and it terrified them. At first I thought they hated me, but I was wrong. They hated what they saw of themselves when they looked at me. Let me explain. There was a woman, Alira. She came to me in spring. A healer, gentle in manner, all smiles and laughter like wind through willow trees. But behind her eyes, I sensed unrest. The kind that doesn't speak, it festers. We spent nights together, not in flesh, but in thought. She would tell me stories. I would ask questions. The more I asked, the more brittle her voice became. Until one night, by firelight, I asked, "Do you love yourself, or just the version others have applauded?" She did not answer. She left before the sun rose. I never saw her again, but I still remember the look in her eyes. Not anger, not sorrow. Terror, as though I had peeled something from her soul she hadn't known was there. And that's when I understood. The mirror effect was not something I controlled. It was simply who I had become, and that becoming had a price. You see, most people don't want to be seen, they want to be worshipped. I want you to nod when they lie, clap when they perform, comfort them when they betray themselves. But I couldn't do that anymore. Not out of cruelty. But because I had stared too long into my own abyss to pretend it was in tea there in others. And so, I became a kind of exile in every room I entered. Smiles faded when I spoke. Conversations died in my silence. People would say, "You're too intense," or "You make everything so serious." But I wasn't serious. I was simply present. And presence, when unfiltered, feels like judgment to those still hiding. There was a young Mantaran full of ambition. He once sought my counsel, said he wanted to live with purpose. I asked him one question. Whose voice are you trying to impress? He went pale, mumbled something about legacy, never returned. That's what the mirror does. It doesn't scream, doesn't correct. It just is, and in its stillness, people see what they've buried. Some recoiled, others grew angry. One man, my own cousin, accused me of madness. "You live like a ghost," he spat. "You think too much? No one wants to be around someone who sees through them." He was right, but he was also confessing. Because to see through others is to remind them that they've built their lives on fog. And fog hates fire. There was a point where I considered dimming my light, softening my voice, looking away when I saw too much. But the moment I tried, something inside me fractured. See, once a man has seen the machinery beneath the masks, he cannot go back to pretending the parade is a dance. He either lives in truth or dies in performance. There is no middle ground. So I remained the mirror. Even when it cost me love, even when it cost me comfort, even when it cost me belonging. Because the mirror holds something sacred. It cannot lie. It cannot flatter. It can only reflect. Reflection, when honest, becomes a kind of violence in a world built on illusion. I've seen women call me cold because I did not chase. Men call me arrogant because I did not echo their delusions. Communities call me distant because I chose solitude over spectacle. But in truth, I was none of those things. I was simply no longer willing to lie for love, and that made me dangerous, because nothing threatens a structure more than the man who refuses to kneel beneath it. The tragedy? Most people will break the mirror before they confront what it reveals. They will call you names. They will rewrite your story. They will exile you from their mythologies. But you must not shatter yourself just to be safe for others. Let them misunderstand. Let them retreat. Let them scream that your stillness is cruelty, because the man who remains unmoved becomes the only true sanctuary left in a trembling world. Kierkegaard once said, "Once you label me, you negate me. But I have learned that being negated by the world is the cost of becoming undivided within. So I sit now beneath the same tree where Alira once laughed, alone again, but not empty. The wind passes through the branches, whispering no applause, only silence. And in that silence, I see myself not in fragments, not in roles, not in reactions, but whole, still true, and unbreakable. I did not win. I did not escape. I became. There is no applause at the end of this path. No hands waiting to pull you into the light. Only stillness. And yet in that stillness, something extraordinary happened. I stopped needing to be seen. For years I wrestled with the ache of misunderstanding, the piercing loneliness that came not from absence, but from being perpetually misread. To be called distant when you're simply discerning. To be called cold when you're merely calm. To be called broken when you have refused to bend. But now, I understand. I was not cursed. I was becoming this wholeness, this unspeakable quiet within. It did not come from victory. It came from surrender, not to the world, but to myself. There was a moment, not long ago, when I stood on the ridge above the valley where I was born. It was dusk. The sky bled violet and ash, and for the first time in years I wept, not from sorrow, not from joy, but from relief. I had survived myself. I had walked through rejection, through the temptation to perform, through the long nights where I almost begged the sky to make me ordinary again. But I never went back, even when every echo in me screamed to be loved, even when I watched others find warmth in illusion, while I sat alone with truth like a cold flame in my hands. That night on the ridge I realized I was no longer searching, no longer waiting to be met, no longer bargaining with the silence. I was the silence. And that, I now know, is freedom. Not the loud kind, not the kind they sell in books and sermons, but the kind that roots you so deeply in yourself that nothing, not rejection, not loneliness, not even love, can make you abandon your core. That's when I knew I had become whole. Not perfect, not healed in some grand redemptive way, but intact. I remembered Kierkegaard's words, "The most common form of despair is not being who you are." And I thought, how strange how many years I spent in quiet despair, trying to dim myself for the sake of belonging. But now, I belong to no one. And that is not tragedy. It is liberation. They still misunderstand me. They still whisper. Even now, when I walk through the village square, the same faces turn away. But I no longer wear the wound-like armor. Their misunderstanding no longer stings. Because I no longer seek to be explained, only to be. Let me tell you something they don't teach. When a man becomes whole, he becomes dangerous. Not because he wields power, but because he cannot be seduced. He doesn't chase validation. He doesn't negotiate with illusion. He doesn't dilute his depth to make others comfortable. He speaks when it matters, and is silent when it doesn't. He walks away not in bitterness, but in clarity, stays not for comfort, but for truth. And above all, he chooses not as a performance, but as a declaration. I will not abandon myself, even if it means walking alone. That is the last rebellion left in this world, to remain authentic. To carry your soul like firewood through the snow, to build no temple for false gods. To kneel only before truth. This wholeness, it will not make you popular. It may not even make you safe, but it will make you real. And being real, in a world trained to reward performance, is the only power worth having. I am not a prophet, not a teacher, not a saint. I am Elias, the man who stayed when it got lonely, the man who listened when silence spoke, the man who chose peace over performance, solitude over spectacle, wholeness over approval, and I do not regret it, because what I have now, this stillness, this rootedness, this alignment, is not something anyone can give, and so it cannot be taken away. There is no finish line, no curtain call, just the quiet breath of a man who has nothing to prove and everything to hold. So if you are listening, and you feel that same ache, that quiet knowing that you are meant for something deeper, then do not abandon yourself to be chosen. Do not shrink to be seen. The world will call you many things. Too much, too distant, too deep. Let them. You do not exist to be understood. You exist to be whole. Whole is exactly what I have become. If you've walked this far with me, brother, then maybe, just maybe, you were never meant to fit in either. Maybe you've always felt the pull toward silence, the ache for something real in a world addicted to noise. Maybe you've been called too much, too quiet, too intense, but you're not too much. You're just too awake for a world that profits from sleep. The path ahead won't be easy. You'll lose things. People, comfort, applause, but what you gain is you, the man beneath the masks, the voice beneath the noise, the soul that refuses to be sold. So let them misunderstand you, them label what they cannot name. Your only task now is to become so rooted in your truth that nothing, no woman, no system, no silence can shake you. If this message found you in your storm, stay. Subscribe. Share this with the man who needs to remember who he is. We're not here to impress. We're here to awaken, because the world doesn't need more nice guys. It needs you. Whole, grounded, dangerous in the most sacred way possible. Let's walk further. Into the fire. Into the truth. Together.